I'm Charlie Sennott, and I wanted to introduce Sebastian, who doesn't need much introduction, but I wanted to share with you that it's more than just two journalists on stage. You're friends, colleagues since 1995. And I want to share how I met Sebastian. So my wife, Julie, who's here tonight, was very deeply into Iyengar yoga and met this amazing woman who's a painter, brilliant, and it was Sebastian's mom. And she invited us for dinner in Belmont, and this is 1995. And Sebastian was working on a book and was very characteristically understated. This isn't something that happened after his success. This is who he is. And he was just very humble about what he was working on. And we asked him, so what's the book about? And he said, it's about a storm. And it was, of course, The Perfect Storm. And it was an amazing first breakthrough book. And his career since then, as you all know, has been just extraordinary. And I wanted to just share that because I think people know Sebastian from Perfect Storm. They know him more now recently in the incredibly important work he's done in the wars in Afghanistan and elsewhere, but mostly Afghanistan. But Sebastian went from The Perfect Storm into really becoming an international correspondent who specialized in covering conflict. And that's where we've really gotten to know each other. We've crossed paths a lot, covered some of the same conflicts, and also he's done extraordinary work in places I haven't covered, like Liberia. But we shared Bosnia, and we ended up in Afghanistan together. And for those of you who don't know Sebastian's work on Afghanistan, there's a piece I want to highlight, which is a profile he did of Massoud, the Northern Alliance commander, who was killed on September 9th, 2001. And that was seen as a trigger for the events of 9/11. But it is a real signature piece by Sebastian and prescient. It was way ahead because it came out, wasn't it in like August or September issue of Vanity Fair before 9/11. And here was this profile of this incredibly important person. And I was talking with Sebastian this morning about why did he do that? And he said he's always just been drawn to the things that really interest him. And in that pursuit of what interests him, he has done some of the most prescient work and really forward-looking work. So I think it's an uncanny ability to see the story and to be ahead of it. We, as I say, crossed paths in Afghanistan, where I was there for the Boston Globe. And most of Sebastian's important work in Afghanistan was in the Korangal Valley, where he worked with his dear friend Tim Hetherington, who I also knew and really respected as a colleague, and who was killed, and who was a huge loss for journalism, huge loss for the world. He was an amazing person. But I just remember going to the edge of the Korangal Valley, you know, as a father of, I guess then we had 4. And I was thinking, there is no way in hell I'm going down into that valley. It was just the most dangerous corner of the war. And I remember that was my point at which I said, that's a place I'm not going. Sebastian and Tim not only went, they went in for a long time. They went in for months and really did extraordinarily important work that was featured in the film Restrepo. Sebastian was co-director of that film. It was nominated for an Academy Award. But once we kind of kept going through the career, I then started the Ground Truth Project, which is about supporting the next generation of journalists and really about sort of trying to create what we call like Teach for America for journalism. It's called Report for America. And Report for the World, which is like the Peace Corps of journalism. We're trying to really put young people out in the field. And Sebastian is on our board of advisors and has been incredibly supportive of that new generation and of our efforts. And so we've deepened our relationship there. And most recently, in reading the book Freedom, I just came back from Afghanistan, and I was reading the book on the way home and after I arrived home. And it really is a story for the whole country about that journey home and what for 20 years have we been fighting for? What is it? Who are we? And why are we fighting for this word freedom? And what does it really mean? And I found the book incredibly healing as a way to think about this turning point for us as we come to the 20th anniversary, as the pullout of troops starts to get underway. It's truly an extraordinary book, and I really Can't wait to hear your thoughts on it. And I'm going to turn it over to you now, Sebastian, but I got to say, the one thing in your life that I think has been so great to see is your wife, Barbara, and your two beautiful daughters who are here. And Barbara's not only an amazing woman and deep love, but a partner in writing. And I just am so happy for you that this coming home is also about you just finding family. So Sebastian Junger is going to talk about the book, Freedom.
Thank you, Red. Appreciate it. Thank you. Hi there. Thank you for coming. What a pleasure to be actually in front of a group of people. This is my first reading since COVID started, and it's funny. It's like I've gotten very used to talking in public, and I found myself a little nervous. It was like a first date or something. Like, oh my God, how is this gonna go? It's also my daughter is right over here, Aisha, and it's her first reading. So hopefully, if I can keep her interested, I'm on the right track. So my book is called Freedom. It's about freedom. People often conflate freedom and rights. One way to think about freedom is in the context of an enemy that will deprive you of your life, will put you in bondage, will enslave you. That's sort of the classic use of the word freedom, and it's an important one. It's one that I address. When people sort of misuse the word within a modern, affluent democracy, what they're really talking about are rights, which are very important. But there's a really important distinction there that we can get to a little bit later. My book is not about, you can all exhale, it's not about the current political moment. But if you write with perception, I hope I did, about an enduring human topic like freedom, you can apply what you understand to any moment in history. Right? Freedom is an enduring human value. In thinking about this, I realized that people throughout history have been willing to risk their lives or to die for three main things. First of all, their community, their tribe, their clan, their nation, whatever it may be. People will risk their lives or will willingly die to protect that sacred entity. They will risk their lives and die to save children, even other people's children. They will run into burning buildings. They will dive into heavy surf. They will do anything to protect children. And the third main thing is that they will die to maintain their freedom, their autonomy. Freedom is so closely connected to our human dignity that life is, for many people, is thought to be not worth living if they're not free. And then, of course, the conversation starts, what do you mean by freedom? Specifically, what are you referring to? But I approach the topic in a more, quite a literal sense. In most mammalian species, size and strength determine the outcome of a fight. Large, strong individuals win fights. Large, strong groups win fights over smaller, weaker groups. That's most of the animal kingdom, right? In humans, that's not true. And you can look at mixed martial arts and boxing to see that a smaller fighter, male or female, very often can win against a larger one. And there's the thing about size and strength, it's great, except it also comes with some downsides that can be exploited. But this truth about humans scales up quite well. And you can have small insurgencies that don't have an air force, don't have tanks, don't have artillery. Some of them don't have boots, and they can defeat empires. I'm not naming names, but I think you know what I'm talking about. To go a little bit further back, the Montenegrins were outnumbered 12-1. In the early 1600s, they were outnumbered 12-1 by the Ottoman Empire. And they defeated them over and over and over again when the Ottomans invaded to turn them into a vassal state. That is uniquely human. And thank God that it works that way, because otherwise, basically, every human group would be dominated by probably by a young, strong male, right? Thank God that's not entirely how this all works, right? And the world would be composed of sort of fascist megastates that impose their will on their own people and on the rest of the world. That's not what the world looks like. There's some of that, but the empire doesn't always win. And maybe the first clearest demarcation between free and not free happened with the advent of agriculture. So what agriculture, around 10,000 years ago, what agriculture allowed people to do was stay in one place, accumulate huge amounts of resources, of food, of money, with which they could maintain standing armies that could be used to protect themselves from enemies. That's great. But also to oppress their own people. I mean, the same army that can defend the community can oppress it. And when agriculture started, there was this other kind of human society that way predated agriculture. There was basically nomadic and mobile. There were hunter-gatherers, there were pastoralists. Because of the nature of their lives, they were often very warlike. If you're not good at fighting, you will probably not stay free for very long, traditionally, in the human experience. And so one of the sort of classic confrontations between wealthy, sedentary society and materially poor, mobile society occurred around 500 BC when King Darius rode north with his vast armies to confront the Scythians. Now, the Scythians were this wild, nomadic, pastoralist people that fought on horseback. They had long hair, they smoked pot, they controlled an area for around 1,000 years from Germany to Afghanistan. Controlled in a kind of nomadic sense. And Darius rode north to confront them. And he finally cornered them. And before the big battle, the armies drew themselves up across a field. And this was in an era when you could see the faces of the men you were going to fight, right? These aren't snipers at 1,000 meters. This is this far away, right? And right during this incredibly awful, tense moment before combat where a lot of people are going to die, the Scythians noticed that there were rabbits running around in the underbrush. And they started hunting them. Waiting for the battle to begin, they started hunting the rabbits with arrows. They're amazing archers. And this sort of act of insolent insouciance right before this apocalyptic battle that Darius would have won. I mean, the Scythians didn't have a chance, right? This is the greatest army ever. Darius was so unnerved by this that he withdrew and he pulled his army out under cover of night. So one of the things that's really interesting about this dynamic between sedentary wealthy societies and materially poor mobile ones is that it's the poorer societies that are mobile and way more egalitarian because you can't carry a lot of wealth. If you're mobile, you just can't lug around generations of accumulated wealth, right? And the leadership is not imposed from the top because you just don't have this sort of standing hierarchy that you can develop in a city, in a city-state. So one of the interesting things about this dynamic between the two kinds of society, and one way to measure the relative value, human value of freedom, is to notice that the poor mobile societies very often want trade goods and things like that from the sedentary societies, but they have enormous contempt for them, right? And there's a wonderful, or they just pity them, right? These people plowing all day long in the fields in the hot sun, and why would you ever want to go through your life like that? And so there's this wonderful saying by the Yomut, who were from the same area as the Scythians. And if I'm doing it by memory, I do not have a mill with willow trees. In other words, I'm not a farmer. I do not have a mill with willow trees. I have a horse and quirt. I will kill you and go. That's how the Yomut saw their affluent sedentary neighbors. So I want to leave lots of time for questions, but I'll just end very briefly with this note. You can't write a book about freedom without pondering your own freedom. And I ask myself, when have I been the most free in my life? It's not a coincidence and there's many kinds of freedom, and my book is dedicated to my family that have given me an emotional freedom, which is completely, mind-blowing for me. I had no idea this feeling existed, right? So, to be clear, right? But in thinking in sort of literal physical terms in my life, when have I been most free? And not coincidentally, it was when I was the most mobile. And that happened when I undertook a trek with 2 or 3 other guys that had also been in a lot of combat. And it was after that part of our lives were done. And we walked along the railroad lines from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia. Then we turned west and headed for Pittsburgh. We called it the Last Patrol. It was illegal to be on the railroad lines. We slept under bridges. We cooked over fires. We got our water out of creeks. We slept in abandoned buildings. We went through the ghettos, the farms, the rich suburbs. We went through everything, right? We called it high-speed vagrancy. We thought of it as high-speed vagrancy. Somebody started shooting at us in Pennsylvania, or at least they were shooting and the bullets were going over our head. I don't know if they're shooting at us, but felt like it anyway. The police had a helicopter looking for us in Maryland. We managed to dodge that. We walked 400 miles, and most nights we were the only people who knew where we were. And as I say in the book, surely, I mean, there are many definitions of freedom, all of them worth discussing, but surely that's an important one. So I look forward to your questions and to Charlie's questions. Thank you for hearing me on this.
Also on the journey was your dog.
Yeah. Yes.
And I remember that passage because you said having these friends, these colleagues, these comrades, and sleeping out, and the feeling of that, and also having a dog that you're like, literally at one point you're using it as a pillow, and there's a very funny scene where Brendan calls it a dog-ass pillow.
Yeah. Right, we were squeezed. We didn't have tents or anything, but we had an old tarp and we were squeezed under it and it was pouring rain. There just wasn't room for everything. And I was like, Daisy, I'm sorry, this is going to happen. And I just put my head, and she loved it, of course, right? I mean, so this was the best time in her brief life.
But there's wonderful moments of the kind of humor that is in the field for soldiers and for those of us who've covered these units and gotten to know them, and it's disarming, and it's really wonderful part of the book is the dialogue between you. I wanted to start off, if I can, I'm going to hand you this quote, because I was going to read it, and then I thought you should read this.
Oh, okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
There's a quote that I think could set up the first question, and just for expectations, we're going to talk for about 15 minutes. I have 3 broad questions, and then we want to get right to your questions. So please get your questions ready, and in 15 minutes we'll be right to them. But I think this paragraph is an extraordinary way to frame our first question.
It contains the observation I just made. We walked around 400 miles, and most nights we were the only people in the world who knew where we were. There are many definitions of freedom, but surely that's one of them. One night we were cooking dinner, and a freight train thundered by with so much speed, so much noise and power, that I tossed out what I thought was an unanswerable question. What would it take to stop something like that instantaneously? I imagined some kind of massive wall, but the answer was more obvious. Another train going just as fast in the opposite direction. America could seem like that as well, a country moving so fast and with so much weight that only a head-on collision with itself could make it stop.
I think that paragraph frames this moment we're in as a country. Like, are we going to get out of our own way? Do we have an equal force coming straight at us? Are we going to continue as a country or not? And I felt like I wanted to ask you about that sense of that train coming at us as a country. And I think what interests me was you, in taking this journey, almost recreating a troop patrol, the feeling of it, the camaraderie. But you were circumnavigating a lot of the feeling in this country, like we are facing not only a global pandemic, what I hope will be a true racial reckoning, a real historic moment, but also the end of America's longest war.
Yeah.
But you avoided sort of the January 6th moment we found ourselves in, which kind of brought all of those things to a head. And it felt to me like January 6th looked a little bit like a freight train heading in our direction. Yeah. What was the strategy? And you addressed it a little bit in the talk, but maybe go a little bit deeper on why avoid the direct politics of this incredibly powerful moment.
Well, first, thank you. First of all, I hope to write books that are enduring. And if you're too topical, I mean, at some point, all of this political drama is going to be old news. I don't know when, I hope soon. But it's, my last book was written during the Republican primary in 2015. Thank God I made no mention of it, right? But what you can do is talk in broad human terms about the reality of human affairs, of human lives, of running a group of people, whether it's a small group of hunter-gatherers that are roughly egalitarian, or a nation of 330 million. These are eternal truths, right? And if you can stumble into them or find them, you don't want to make your book obsolete by being too specific. But the other reason is that I happen to be a Democrat. My dad grew up in Europe. He was a refugee from 2 wars. I have political beliefs like any person does. But as a journalist, I feel it's a kind of sacred duty to be as impartial and neutral and unbiased as possible. And I know that, and as a result, and because I've covered the military a lot of people read me who don't share my political beliefs, but they admire me. And I'm actually, I think, in a kind of wonderful position of actually communicating to those people something that I think is true. And either you revise your view about me, or maybe you'll listen to what I have to say. And so by not calling out the current president or making, I think, rightful accusations of bad faith, I'm not going to convert other people with that anyway. Other people are doing that, right? And I will lose my readers and any chance of actually maintaining an important communication with them. So, and I do the same thing with the left. I mean, the left can be pretty Looney Tunes themselves, right? And I don't hesitate to call it out, right? And so anyway, that for me is like, as I said, almost a kind of sacred role for journalists.
Yeah, it's what I really loved about the tone of the book. And I want to read one short paragraph of page 103 where you go right at this audience.
Yeah.
In both Western and Native traditions, a warrior culture was fostered that could defend the tribe or nation, but was under the direct control of civilians. And civilians had to be willing to give up leadership when they were overruled by a majority, because they presumably valued having no power in a fair system more than they valued having all the power in an unfair one. And I just try to picture so many of these awesome people who are in our military and who do really love your writing and have seen you as someone they can trust. I just think this was such a powerfully resonant message at this
Thank
time
you.
without going directly at it.
Yeah, and my dad grew up in Spain. He fled when Franco took over with his fascists. He fled to France and then fled again to this country because of the Germans. And so some percentage of any population doesn't agree with that sentence. They're like, no, sorry, we'd actually rather have power. Thank you. Like, we don't actually believe, we'll fight fair as long as we win the fight. And at that point, we won't fight fair, right? I mean, people don't fight fair in prison knife fights, right? I mean, why would we? I mean, there's a little bit of that thinking. And so I think it was important for me, like the second great demarcation between freedom and non-freedom. I mean, the first one was mobile societies versus sedentary ones, which have these terrible hierarchies that can be enormously unjust to the bottom 90%, right? But the other great demarcation is democracies and totalitarian states. And basically, if you're not a democracy, eventually you're a totalitarian state. And that's been true for 10,000 years, right? So right now, here we are in a very affluent democracy, and inevitably some portion of any population is, you know what, I'm not that into the democracy, actually. We haven't won a popular election in 30 years. Why should we be part of this? It's not working for us. I have an answer for that, but I feel like it's very important to be very precise about the dynamics there.
So I have 2 more questions, so please get your questions ready. And this next question is really about what you learned on the journey, and who were some of these characters who you met, who you felt like really helped you understand the word freedom on the road in America?
Yeah. Well, we passed through all kinds of communities, and one of the things I was most struck by was that the poorer the community, the friendlier it was. And in some ways, like affluent communities, there's a lot to lose. I mean, just in sort of material terms, right? And people can be very paranoid. I grew up in a community like that, right? And so when we're walking through the ghettos of Baltimore, my God, like what an experience for us. And It's very, very moving. But the other thing that I encountered was that freedom and danger, freedom and safety do not coexist, right? The freer you are, the more unfettered you are in your obligations. And the ultimate expression of freedom is to be completely by yourself. But humans die immediately when they're alone in nature. They survive the night, maybe, right? So we get our safety, we got our lives, basically, from the fact that we're part of a community. And collectively, not only can we survive in nature, we can thrive, right? And so on this trek, this would have been a terrifying trek if I'd done it by myself, but I did it with 2 or 3 guys. And what the deal was that if you don't participate in all the things we need to do, get the water, build the fire, check for the police, blah, 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 you're not part of this group and you're not in it, you're out. I looked at a criminal gang in Chicago in the 1960s, the Vice Lords. And their definition of being they were formed to protect, of young African-American men who formed this group to protect themselves from the predations of other criminal gangs around them. And they formed this group and they controlled 40 square blocks and they were able to protect themselves. The first definition of freedom is that you can defend yourself, right? And that you're not part of a group that oppresses you. Those are the 2 basic definitions of freedom. So what these guys did is they organized themselves and they could defend themselves. And the definition of being a vice lord, they didn't have some fancy, whatever. It's like if you see another vice lord in a street fight, no matter how bad the odds are, if you're a vice lord, you will run towards him and help him. And if you run the other way, you're not a vice lord. It's really simple, right? And if you're not a vice lord, but you think you are, if you're in the group and you don't act accordingly, they don't touch you, right? They just pick you up, they put you in the backseat of a car, and they drive you into the center of the rival gang's territory, and they just make you get out of the car. There you go, right? So, I mean, America is an extraordinary character in itself, and we had amazing encounters. But one of the most extraordinary things we did was encounter ourselves, our own vulnerabilities, our own need for others. I mean, that's anyone who thinks that they're like autonomous and free in any sense, you need to experience sort of survival level group cooperation. It completely changes your understanding of yourself.
So last question is going to be really about like this moment. Our country has never been so divided. I don't think we've ever felt more polarized. And I just wanted to share that this organization, the Ground Truth Project, is about being there on the ground. That's the whole idea. How do you create a whole new generation that can really, I'm sorry I have my back to some of you guys, this is not very nice. How do you create a feeling among a whole new generation of journalists to do what Sebastian has done, which is to go out, to be there, to see these stories, to walk through, really seriously poor corners of Baltimore and into the countryside and try to talk with people. And I feel like we have a wonderful opportunity for a new generation of journalists to see what Sebastian does. But I just want to hit a somber note, and that is that journalism is in an unbelievably deep crisis in America. And the kind of work that Sebastian does is not getting done as much anymore, if you haven't noticed. This idea of going deep, of going in and really trying to find the story, spending time with people. And I think you should just be aware. Here in New England, it can be quite easy to think we have a media ecosystem that's really pretty vast, and it is. But across the country, the places you are traveling, like if you go through rural Pennsylvania, every small town newspaper is dying out. 2,000 communities in America no longer have anyone telling their story. And as a result, they're kind of pissed off. They want to be heard, and no one's hearing their story. And I thought a big part of the power of your book was going out and hearing those stories. And I'm just curious if you saw anything along the journey that might suggest to us how we begin to come back together. Yeah. Like, how do we find a way as a country to pull it back together?
I mean, everyone that I met seemed quite invested in the idea that they were American, right? And that they were free, right? And that was an important word. I didn't bring that word to this trip. It came to me, right? I mean, we were in extremely poor, very, very violent or a high murder rate, African-American community south of Philly. And there was this guy drinking a beer on his porch, big, waved to us, we walked over to talk to him, and I said, hey, I'm just curious, what do you think is the best thing about America? And he said, freedom, it's a free country. I mean, that was the first word out of his mouth. This town had the highest murder rate in America at one point, a totally broken community, and even he understood, despite the very obvious tragedies, social tragedies all around him, that we're very, very lucky to be in this country with the democratic system such that it is, with all of its bugs and flaws, that we're extremely lucky. And I think a lot of people felt that. And, honestly, I think the impetus in this country is towards, in some ways, towards unity, until people start hearing very powerful people in leadership positions talking otherwise, right? And when your leaders tell you it's not a unified country, pretty soon it's self-fulfilling, right? Married couple having a fight, you start talking about divorce, you're gonna get divorced, right? I mean, language often precedes belief, right? So I think one of the things we have to do is actually somehow have sanctions against rhetoric that actually is counter to our national security. And that kind of divisive rhetoric is directly counter to it. It's as dangerous to this nation and its security as Al-Qaeda. In fact, I'd say it's around 1,000 times more dangerous, right? I don't know how, there's free speech. So, I mean, you can't legally sanction that kind of speech, but politically you can sanction it, right? Speaking like that can have, I think we need a system where that has penalties. I mean, social and political penalties. I don't know how to get there, but that's the thing. It's that kind of language that starts the hemorrhaging of trust in a country. And then pretty soon you have yourself like a really, really dangerous conflict.
And do you think we as journalists have fueled the fires of some of that? Have we, I'm really conscious of where we've failed, where we have not listened carefully, where we haven't told the stories well, and where we therefore have lost that trust. And I'm curious your
I think journalism was intentionally dismantled so that people could do things, right? I mean, I think there was a sort of concerted effort. Facts and reality are getting in the way of certain political agendas. Well, let's just pretend those things don't exist, right? So I think in some ways we're too lucky. Most groups require individual participation. If you're in a platoon, if you're in a group of hunter-gatherers, if you're, among the Scythians, right, whatever, if you're in the Vice Lords, to be part of that group, you have to do something for that group. And we know, psychologists know, that the more you sacrifice for something, the more you value it. And one of the sort of unintended ironies, and I would say maybe even tragedies of affluent Western society, is that we are so affluent, we've mechanized so many survival needs, automated, so many things that need to be done, have always been done by human beings, that we actually have the feeling that we can belong to a nation or a town or anything. We actually can belong to those things, get all the benefits of inclusion, and actually not owe anything. That's new in human experience. And I think what happens is people in this country may not even value the fact that they're part of this country sufficiently because it doesn't ask anything of them. And I'm not arguing for the draft at all. I mean, there's ways to get people to participate. But I think it's an unfortunate effect of affluence. And, the way I sort of say it is, what you have a right to is a freedom from oppression. You don't have a right to freedom from obligation. And it's up to all of us to figure out, what do we owe this country? I mean, morally, politically, financially, in terms of our sweat and our time and our passion, what do we owe? And I think if we figure that out, first of all, we'll save the country. But we are also, for all of our wealth and good fortune, we're in an incredibly unhappy place. I mean, just the numbers are horrible. Anxiety and depression and suicide and addiction for such an affluent place. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable how poorly people are doing psychologically. And I think actually, by you, I mean we all, right? We all figure out what we owe this country. Yeah, we'll save the country, but you will also save yourselves. We will all save ourselves individually. I talked to a guy, he's not in the book, but I talked to a guy who'd done 30 years in prison for doing something extremely wrong, terrible, a terrible crime. And he was let out on good behavior, extraordinary man, educated in prison, brilliant, beautiful human being. And I see he'd just gotten out like a week earlier. And I said, I was like, I'm a little embarrassed to ask this, but is it possible to be more free in prison than outside of prison? And he looked at me like I was nuts. He was like, of course it is. Are you kidding? Do you know where I'm from? He's like, you can't be a drug addict in prison. All you got is time. You can't, you will develop a relationship with yourself in prison. You can't be addicted to your iPhone in prison. I mean, he was listing these things that people can do in a free society that wrenches them away from a healthy relationship with their own selves. It's like, you spend enough time in prison, you got nothing but time, and eventually you will have an honest conversation with yourself about who you really are and what you're really doing there. And when you finally have that conversation, you're a free person. And that's the conversation that we all, outside of the prison walls, outside of the platoons, right, outside of the coal mining jobs and all that really rough, dangerous stuff that keeps this country going, that's a conversation that we all often don't have with ourselves. And we're the lesser for it.
Thank you. Thank you. We should go to your questions. Yeah, I think that's worthy of a pause. I'm gonna ask when you come up to ask a question, please try to keep the questions a little bit short and make sure it is indeed a question. At the microphone, we should go to the microphones to ask. Okay, so we'll go to you first, sir, and then we'll come right back to you.
The obvious question is, was Biden right in pulling out of Afghanistan?
Well, I can repeat it. Was Biden right in pulling out of Afghanistan? Look, I'm sorry, was there more question, or can I just answer that?
And I was just going to tell you, I heard about your trip. I don't know if you've ever read them, but you should read books by an English author named Leigh Fermor, Fermor.
Okay.
About a very similar trip that took 2 years.
Okay, good. I will. Thank you. Thank you. So was he right to pull out of Afghanistan? I'm a journalist. There's a very, very smart friend of mine said, much smarter than me, said, journalists don't tell you what to think. They tell you what to think about. All right? I'm not going to tell you if it was right or wrong. But I will say that, in my opinion, I'm not sure that our national security necessarily will go down if we let Afghanistan fall back into a kind of failed state dominated by an extremist Islamic regime. It may. I don't know that for sure. It may not. But I'm pretty sure the Afghans themselves are really going to suffer. So does that make it the right decision or the wrong decision? It was a very small number of troops. We were not there with 100,000. We were there with 2,000. It seems to be a kind of tripwire that I don't think the Taliban ever would quite be able to maneuver around. So you tell me. I mean, that's the question. That's how to think about it. You tell me. I'm not, I can't tell you.
You just riffed on three powerful and pernicious forces that are at work at large today in our society. There's the decline of the free press, decline of journalism, and faith in journalism. And you talked about the rise of divisive rhetoric, political rhetoric, and dishonest political rhetoric. And and you talked about the absence of shared common responsibility.
Yeah.
How responsible is social media in your mind for those forces?
Great question.
Yeah, so where is it? First of all, this is my phone. I know social media has its uses. It's a very powerful tool, but I hate it. Really, and again, the data is pretty bad particularly for teenagers, the effect of social media on anxiety and depression and suicide and all that. I'm not a psychologist, so you can find that out yourself, but it's pretty appalling. And I think it social media can, sort of weaponize the the most exercised extremist opinions, weaponize them very, very well, and it spreads like a kind of virus. And are we better off than before Facebook started in 2012 and the teenage suicide rate skyrocketed? I don't think we are. I really don't, and I could have an iPhone, but I don't want one because I don't want to lose my relationship with myself, and I know that would happen. I'm a human being. We're addictive creatures. Like, I know exactly what I would do with that thing, right? It's the same reason I don't have a pack of cigarettes at home. Like, I got it. Like, I'm not going to keep it around. And so I just, don't have it near me.
I'd like to maybe even add a little bit to that, because this is right where we live. And with all these young journalists we support, we have 300 reporters in 200 newsrooms across America. And I had a chance pre-pandemic to be in Mississippi and Ohio and see what the devastating impact on the business side of social media and what it's done to polarize our country, to pull us apart. And you see it mostly in these news deserts in America, these places where there's no information anymore. We know three things happen. Voter participation plummets, polarization increases, and a really interesting third data point is bond ratings drop. Banks don't want to invest in communities where no one is watching the store. And the connection here of the death of local news to social media is about 70% of digital ad revenue goes to two companies, Google and Facebook. And if you want to, I thought it was really brilliant what Sebastian said about these are economic forces at work that are putting the truth out of business. And we're going to have to find the new ways to do that. So our program is called Report for America. It's like Teach for America for journalism. And there's some sheets here. Anybody who wants to know more about this, I think we got to get, as journalists, much better at telling our own story about the crisis we're in. We tell stories about the crisis in the steel industry. We tell stories about all these crises in our country. And the crisis in local journalism is as big as any story I've ever covered. So I hope I don't sound too pitchy, but I'm trying to say, please be aware of this going on, and please help us figure out how we're going to solve it, because it's going to take us all thinking about it.
Yeah, thank you. First and foremost, thank you all both for all your work in Afghanistan. At a young age, I spent 22 months in Afghanistan, all around the country for a couple of different departments, and I really appreciate it. I'm now working on a philosophy PhD, studying existentialism, particularly in the vein of Black existentialism. Freedom is central to that conversation that existentialists are having, and I've heard a number of different sort of threads that you've pulled on here, particularly around different, like, what's political freedom versus moral freedom is one of the things that you pulled up. And I'm wondering, one of the ways that that drew me to existentialism, or one of the really important concepts, is sort of liberty versus freedom. And I think that we typically, or at least the way that I read it, we typically think of liberty as the sort of removal of barriers for us to get to our political goals or our desires. I've come to think about it, to your point, as sort of freedom equals liberty plus responsibility. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the relationship between liberty and the concept of liberty, and how you differentiate that from freedom.
Right. It's always terrible to be in a reading with someone who's smarter than you. You look a little familiar. I think we met 4 years ago. Did we have a conversation 4 years ago? You seem a little familiar.
You look familiar too.
All right. So, all right. What else? I'm an anthropologist, and I think of things. I think of things in those terms, right? So, what we think of as civilization is very, very recent. The human race is 200,000 years old. Agriculture started 10,000 years ago. The Industrial Revolution started 200 years ago. It's just yesterday that all this stuff has changed. So, in managing a nation of 330 million requires some ingenuity, particularly because you're working with a body and a mind that is adapted to life in a group of 30 to 40 people in nature, sort of hunter-gatherer's existence. That's the vast majority of our human experience. Our evolution has adapted us to that reality. Our minds are adapted to that. So how do you take that and manage a nation of 330 million? It's very difficult. And the most efficient way to do it, thus far, seems to be democracy. And one of the things about democracy, like there's many important points to it, is, and I hope I'm eventually answering your question, but there's many important points to it. I mean, first of all, the human reality is that if you're part of a group, you have to help it survive. And if you don't, you're not wanted, right? And that suddenly in a modern industrial state, that relationship is not quite so clear. And you have people who are completely dependent on the society for a variety of reasons, including that they're too wealthy. Like they just don't have to do anything because they have so damn much money, right? And they actually don't have to help much, right? And so, or they're incapacitated in some way, whatever, disenfranchised, there are all kinds of reasons. But so in a democracy, one of the brilliant things that the framers did, in my opinion, not only did they give the vote to the public, and of course it took way too long to understand that meant every adult person. I mean, it took shamefully long to understand, for this nation to understand that. But the other thing, one of the other things that they did, these were very powerful people, very powerful men in colonial society. And they wrote the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, the Emancipation Declaration, and they did not exempt themselves from from consequences, right? They did not say, well, we're powerful and we actually aren't accountable to the same laws that everyone else is. The kings and queens of Europe, until then, were not accountable in any way, right? Power meant you did not have to answer to the public for anything you did, including murder and rape and theft and everything else. And suddenly what the framers did is say, you know what, we're part of this. Leaders do not have extra rights. Leaders are not protected from justice. And neither are the generals, neither are the sheriffs, right? Neither are the heads of corporations, neither are the presidents, right? And the people that wrote the tax laws, they themselves pay taxes, right? And so it's a really interesting, novel human idea that if you rewind history enough back to the era of mobile societies and at a sort of hunter-gatherer or pastoralist level, that was absolutely the norm, right? And then that disappeared with the advent of the modern nation state, the modern nation. And so when you talk about responsibility and liberty and all of that, I mean, understand that the conundrum is very recent. Like for 200,000 years, it was quite obvious. Like you have equal status in this group and you owe it a lot. You might even owe it your life, right? My dad told me that when I thought I didn't want to sign up for selective service at age 18 in 1980. And he came over here from Europe, right, where American soldiers saved the world from fascism. He's like, look, if it's an immoral war, don't fight it. Go to prison if you need to. Don't fight it. But it might be a moral war. It might be a war that needs to be fought, and you don't owe your nation nothing. And you may owe it your life. You don't know yet. And that, to me, is at the heart of a healthy society and of a healthy democracy. Like, what do you owe?
It's got to be noted that it took almost 100 years to figure out, and a very bloody civil war to figure out there was a huge part of the country that was not part of that equation, and still many would argue is not. And I am as humbled by Sebastian in an audience where you know you're intellectually outclassed here, but I want to offer something to you that I hope might be, it just occurred to me, that your equation, freedom equals liberty plus responsibility. I love that. I'm going to hold on to that. But I want to offer one proposed addendum to the equation. Freedom equals liberty plus responsibility divided by truth. If we don't have the constant of truth, we don't know what those terms mean, right? So I think that constant, that baseline of truth is a big word, truth. But on a local level, when you break it down into whether or not to build the new roof on the school, or whether or not the dangerous pothole at this intersection is going to get fixed, or whether or not a corrupt local politician has really stolen money from the budget and needs to get busted for it, like, if we don't have that baseline shared set of facts, I don't think the equation's going to hold. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Weirdly, my question is also about existentialism.
Why don't you guys come on up here?
Right.
So when you were talking about the Persians versus the Scythians, it made me think a lot about Nietzsche and how he divided the world into a master mentality, which was like the Scythians, like you're all
So glad she's looking at you right now.
And the slave mentality, which is like these, corrupt empires where most people are super disempowered. And what I was wondering is that narrative has been co-opted a lot by the right, both in the past and now. We have, your Jordan Petersons saying that we are like the decadent West and we need to go back to the old days. So do you ever worry that your, thoughts about freedom and liberty might get co-opted by people that you don't agree with?
Oh, of course. I mean, anytime you say something, and whether it's true or not, that doesn't matter. It can be co-opted. I mean, anything can be used to good or bad ends. And, I'm pretty clear when I talk about freedom. I'm pretty clear that what I mean is an egalitarian society that, in its ideal form, an egalitarian society where the leaders are not necessarily powerful. They're leaders, right? But that doesn't mean they have extra rights. They have extra power that they can anyway subjugate the people they're leading. And that is something that Western society really struggles with and still does. And let's face it, like the affluent elite in both parties can get away with stuff that other people can't. I'm sorry, and I mean, listen, I'm a lifelong lefty, right? But I'm, my half of the political equation has their own sins to answer to, and one of them is that, economically they have exempted themselves from an awful lot of responsibility and accountability. I mean, I remember during the Gulf War, during the Iraq War, in 2003, which I was completely opposed to. I covered Afghanistan. I refused to go to Iraq. I thought it was a huge mistake. I couldn't be objective about it, and I didn't want to get killed covering a mistake. And I'm like, okay, I'm not doing that. I'm going to Afghanistan. I'm not going to Iraq. And I was amazed, I lived part of the time on Cape Cod, in Truro, Massachusetts, and I was amazed, super liberal place, my people, whatever. And I was amazed that there were people driving around with huge SUVs with no blood for oil on the bumper sticker, as a bumper sticker, right? I'm like, how hypocritical can you be, right? Are you getting 8 miles to the gallon? You're sucking this stuff up, and you're saying, but please don't kill anyone for this stuff. Like, that's nonsense, right? So anyway, that's a long, heated answer to your question, but I think that ultimately the answer is you have to be really precise in your terms. And if people misuse it, it's very easy to rebut. And but you'll never stop people from misusing good thoughts, right? But I'll tell you what, it's even easier to misuse bad thoughts. So I'm just going to keep saying things that I think are true and good and right.
Speaking of tribes, do you think that the New York Times would be a better news organization if it had fewer people with college educations? And secondly, how do you feel about mandatory government service for everyone, at age 18 or something?
Awesome questions. So personally, thank you. Personally, the smartest people that I personally know in my life didn't go to college, right? But they were intellectually motivated and ambitious and unbelievably curious about the world and huge readers, right? So that's a prerequisite for me for the kind of job that I presume exists at the New York Times, right? If you have the degree or not, I don't think it matters that much. But I should also go on to say that I adore the New York Times. It's an amazing institution. It infuriates me almost daily. And it's an incredibly elitist publication, right? And that elitism shows through in its op-eds and some of its attitudes, whatever. And they're also doing a huge amount of good in the world. So don't get me wrong. But I can see it. And I can see it because I'm from that world and I recognize it. And so if you could change that at the New York Times by bringing in some people that aren't from that subculture, yeah, absolutely do it. And mandatory service, I think, you could serve your country without carrying a rifle. And actually, I think if there was mandatory public service, it would make people love this country more, which I think is a good thing. It would invest them in the moral fabric of this society in a way that they might not be right now, because now they got skin in the game because they spent a year or two of their youth doing something good for this country. Climate change is going to require a lot of tough jobs fighting fires, that kind of floods, that kind of thing. It would be an amazing way to use those young people. And finally, it would bring people of all races and creeds and economic backgrounds, and it would put them in the same barracks, right? And that's what the military does. And that's one of the most profound things about the U.S. military is it mixes people like that. And so, I would say, yes, if I could vote, if I was president, I think I would probably, my first law might be mandatory national service with a military option.
I want to add to that answer to that question. I'm so glad you asked about service. And as Sebastian said, there's going to be a lot of different ways to serve the country. And there's a real service movement in America that is happening.
Yeah.
So Teach for America. You've got programs like Conservation Corps and these programs that are really for young people. I have 4 young sons. I'm so encouraging them to think about how they can serve. You don't, as Sebastian said, you don't have to pick up a gun to serve this country. And I think this thing we're doing, Report for America, is a service program. It's a call to service. And journalists are going to have to stop being afraid to be a little patriotic about the service of journalism, particularly local journalism, to the country. We're all get a little weird and quiet, and I can feel the skin crawl on the back of my neck if I talk about this in too patriotic a fervor. But on the other hand, we are in a struggle for who we are as a country, and we're going to have to find ways to serve. I really hope Report for America becomes one of these ways young people see as a way to go out and serve. And my favorite Report for America Corps member is a kid named Will Wright, who went to the University of Kentucky, who got a job working for the Lexington Herald in Kentucky, covering coal country. And the New York Times called us up and said, "Who's your most talented RFA Corps member?" And we said, "There's this young man, Will Wright." And he is not the kind of young man who'd end up in the New York Times very often. And he got hired by the Times. And I'm like, if we do that, if we can bring some people who, he had a wonderful college education, but not at a place many people working at the New York Times come from. And I think we're going to have to work together to really aggressively reach out to people from other corners of this country and start talking to each other. So thank you. I think we're at the closing here. I want to say thank you, Sebastian. That was
Thank you.
spectacular.
Thank you, everybody.